Now I'll really be winded. You've got to jump on me, a head start on me. We're so close, aren't we? We've just got another chapter left in the book of Acts, and we'll be done. And this is a really good part of the story. It's amazing how, it's kind of like when you read a good novel at the end, there's all this excitement, and there's a lot going on with Paul and his companions here in the last couple chapters of the book of Acts, and some good things came of that. And we won't read. We've already covered a good deal of the book, or a good half of it at least, last week, and so we won't have to cover all of the ground that we did before. But basically they set sail. If you were with us last week, they set sail for Rome, and so they left Caesarea, where Paul had been kind of imprisoned for a couple years, and he wasn't really. He had some freedoms. He could have visitors and such, but he wasn't a free man. He wasn't free to go. But he'd already decided that's exactly what God wanted him and where God wanted him, and he was determined to go to Rome. And so God's allowing that to happen and take place. And so they started off and set sail, Roman centurion and other soldiers, Paul and his companions, some other prisoners. They set off on a ship heading west. And I mentioned, if you ever look on a map, you can see it was quite a journey that they took, all around some different isles, all through the Mediterranean Sea. They traveled there, and we left off last week. They'd entered into a big storm called Euroclydon. And Euroclydon is basically was a strong east wind. It was a type of storm that's even common today on the Mediterranean, that will come up from a strong east wind. There's different various things that around here, but anytime we have a cold front come through and the temperature drops quickly, be ready. You're probably going to have some weather, and they had weather. That's to say the very least. It was rough. I can find my place here. I'd like to start back on verse 22 so we can see what happened there. They go back to verse 21 or 20. I keep going back. We'll get there eventually. 20. And when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. But after long abstinence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, you should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. And now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God, that it shall be even as it was told me. Howbeit we must be cast upon a certain island. And so that's kind of where we left off last week. And so if we look at those verses there, in verse 22, Paul encouraged, Acts chapter 27. Acts chapter 27. And Paul encourages them and exhorts them, tells them to be of good cheer, that nobody's life would be lost. Only the loss of the ship would be something they would experience. That wouldn't be pleasant in and of itself, but at least their lives would be spared. And he had this great confidence in the midst of these, what was a very bleak, a very dire circumstance. And, Paul goes on again in verse 23 through 25. He's able to say that because God has told him, Fear not, Paul, for you must be brought before Caesar. And God's promised to save Paul, but not just Paul, but all of those that sail with him, all the people on the ship. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And he said, Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God. And, I think we ended up pretty much last week talking about those questions. Like sometimes I start with questions, sometimes I end with questions. The questions were, do you believe God? Do you believe His promises? Do you trust His word? See, Paul believed it would be just as it was told him. Do you believe it will be just as God has told us in His word? Do you believe His promises? I don't know. I'm glad God filed all these old hymns away in my mind, and I hope you enjoy when God brings them back to your mind. And literally just now, couldn't help but think, standing on the promises. You know, Paul was standing on the promises of God, and we ought to stand on the promises of God every single day. There's no other way we can stand in truth. If you're trying to stand on anything else but God's promises, you're on sinking sand. You know, do you believe it will be just as God has told you by His Word, by His Holy Spirit? Do you believe God will perform that which He has promised? I think that's a wonderful verse. Remember what it says there back in Romans 4:21? You don't have to turn there for sake of time, but in Romans 4:21, this is said of Abraham, and being fully persuaded that what he had promised, he was able also to perform. So, you know, we know how there's much said about Abraham and how he believed God and it was counted unto him for righteousness, and he was a man of faith. He trusted God. You know, when God said, go to a place, to a country that you don't know where you're even heading, just head out and I'll tell you how to get there. And, you know, it was a great life of faith that Abraham lived, and I think that's a wonderful testimony. And being fully persuaded that what he had promised, he was able also to perform. You know, in order to live an effective and a victorious Christian life, and I think we all want to be effective, you know. Sometimes we do things in life and they don't really work out as well as we'd like. We don't want to just be doing something in a vain way. We want it to be effective and get the job done. And if you want to be effective as a Christian, you want to be victorious as a Christian in this life, you're going to have to be fully persuaded that God is who He says He is, and that God will perform or God will do what He said He would do. You know, I really think that's what the essence of the verse where it says, but without faith it is impossible to please God, for we must believe that He is. That's basically saying you must believe God is who He said He is. For we must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of them that diligently seek Him. You need to believe God is who He said He is, and He'll do what He said He would do. And then really the new stuff now, we'll get into verse 26 tonight. He said, howbeit we must be cast upon a certain island. Verse 27, but when the 14th night was come, and we were driven up and down in Adria, about midnight the shipmen deemed that they drew near to some country, and sounded and found it 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little further, they sounded again and found it 15 fathoms. Then, fearing lest we should have fallen upon rocks, they cast 4 anchors out of the stern and wished for the day. And as the shipmen were about to flee out of the ship, when they had let down the boat into the sea, under color as though they would have cast anchors out of the foreship, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, except these abide in the ship, ye cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat and let her fall off. And while the day was coming on, Paul besought them all to take meat, saying, this day is the 14th day that ye have tarried and continued fasting, having no thing. Wherefore I pray you to take some meat, for this is for your health, for there shall not an hair fall from the head of any of you. And when he had thus spoken, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. Then were they all of good cheer, and they also took some meat. And we were all in the ship 260 souls. And we'll stop there for just a minute and talk about this. You know, and we covered a little bit of this just kind of in a quick recap at the end, or a quick summarization at the end. But, you know, they were facing a treacherous storm that God had He'd only promised the salvation of the people, not of the ship. And he said that they must be cast upon a certain island, and it would actually be evident later why. God had a purpose for that. Isn't it something? We think about this terrible storm that was raging. We think about the loss of the ship. We think about all what a terrible experience it was, not only for Paul, but all the ones that were with him. And we can be so short-sighted. We're caught up in the circumstances, and we're caught up in the storm, and we're caught up in the negative part of it. But there was a purpose for all of that. God didn't just allow them to go into the storm and it all be for naught, and all be for vain. It was because there was a certain island that God had deemed that they needed to be shipwrecked upon. And we'll find out in Acts chapter 28 why. And it's a pretty amazing story. And so, you know, here's the thing. it would be evident later what God was up to. I think at least to Paul, probably to Luke and those that were believers, that they must be cast upon a certain island. But for now, they can only trust God. And I wanted to say that to say this: God may send you to a certain place. He may send you through some storms to get there. It may be a place that you weren't expecting to go. Maybe you don't even want to go. Maybe you think it's a detour, or it's something that's going to slow you down from getting where you think God has ultimately wants you to go. But I want you to consider, as we see in this story here, and we'll see next time in Acts chapter 28, that God had a purpose for this. Yes, the goal was to get Paul to Rome, and so Paul could stand before Caesar. That was the goal. But guess what? Along the way, God had other things He wanted Paul to do. And He wanted him to go to this, be shipwrecked on this island. And so, remember that. God may have a very good reason, and I know we've talked about this from time to time, and people have testified of this here at the church, but there may be a good reason that something happens, some weird circumstance, and you don't get out of the driveway right when you think you should, and you get about a mile down the road and there's a terrible car accident, and you think, ooh, if I'd have left right when I expected to leave, and right when I wanted to leave, and right when I thought I would leave, I would have been maybe right in the middle of that mess. You never know the circumstances, the reasons some things happen. And remember what John chapter 4, verse 4 says? Jesus was speaking, and remember what it says of Jesus. It was speaking of Jesus. Remember what it says in John 4:4? And He must needs go through Samaria. It didn't mean that He was just going to go through Samaria for no reason. It was just the faster route, because it was the faster route. The Jews would go around Samaria because they didn't like the Samaritans. And we talked about that a little bit this morning, about how that all started, didn't we? About how that mess came about, where they were kind of not getting along very well. But it says, and He must needs go through Samaria. We talked about this morning. Think about this. If Jesus would not have went through Samaria, He would not have met the woman at the well, and she would not have met her Savior. And there wouldn't have been a bunch of other people that she went back to the town and said, hey, come see a man that told me everything I ever did. And they came down and they met Jesus, and I'm sure many of them trusted and were saved. So think about that. Sometimes we must needs go through maybe a place we don't really like to go through, in a storm in some cases, like with the Apostle Paul. But it was needful. We've got to consider that. We live in a society that doesn't want to do anything that just is even halfway uncomfortable, and certainly not anything that puts us off or causes us to have to, do anything that would disturb our routine or whatever it is we deem as the thing we need to be doing at that time. But we need to be aware that God's putting people in our path, and God's doing things in our life all the time, and we don't need to get so caught up with, I've got to get to point B, that we can't see when God's putting people on our path, and we might need to stop and see for a second. Verses 27 through 30 there, that 14th night they knew they were tossed about. They were up and down the Sea of Adria. It's also called the Ionian Sea in ancient times. It was just the open sea there between Crete, Sicily, Italy, North Africa. Based on what I could read and what I saw, kind of conflicting information, but it seems to be that this was not the same as the Adriatic Sea, the modern Adriatic Sea. It was the Sea of Adria. It's also known as the Ionian Sea that was there. And they knew they were drawing near to land. They found it 20 fathoms deep, 15 fathoms deep. They were being driven into the shallows. They cast 4 anchors from the stern of the ship. They hoped not to run aground. It was certainly an act of desperation. They began preparing to flee from the ship. They let down the lifeboat into the sea. And it's interesting, if you really read it carefully, and you can do that for your homework if you want to. I don't want to read it again for sake of time. But if you read it carefully, it uses a word that they did it by color, and it's spelled like a different way than you would spell the word color today. And what they were trying to do is they were trying to do it secretly. The sailors, the men of the ship, they let down the boat. but it says that they made it look like they were letting down the anchors in the front of the ship. Because probably what was fixing to happen is they were probably going to try to get off the boat on the lifeboat and leave the rest of them to fend for themselves. And so these sailors began to prepare to flee the ship. They let down the lifeboat in secret. They covered their actions by pretending to let anchors down from the front of the ship. And these are what they did there in verses 27 through 30. And in fact, we can look at that real quick. It says in verse 30, "And the shipmen were about to flee out of the ship when they had let down the boat into the sea under color," that means kind of undercover or in secret, "as though they would have cast anchors out of the foreship." That's what they made it. They wanted it to appear like they were doing. And so, verse 31, "Then Paul perceives their action." He's aware of what they're trying to do. "He told the centurion and the soldiers that were with him, if these men, these sailors, leave the ship, if they didn't stay in the ship, that none of them would be saved." So at this point, I think in desperation, and because Paul had been nothing but, everything he'd said thus far had come to pass or was true, the soldiers believed. In verse 32, they intervened. They cut the ropes from the lifeboat. They let it fall away. And then in verses 33 through 36, there was a time to fast. And during that time, they were working so hard to try to save the ship. They probably didn't even have a desire to eat. Can you imagine the middle of the storm they were in? Nobody would have had the time or the care or the desire to eat food. They were just in desperate circumstances trying to just save their very lives and keep the boat from coming apart and breaking apart and sinking and going under the waves. And so there was a purpose for Paul and his companions to fast. Now, I know undoubtedly Paul and them that were with him, they didn't only fast, but they prayed for God he would intervene and he would save them. And it was a long 14 days, without a doubt. But there was now hope. God revealed to Paul the plan of his protection. God gives us little glimmers of hope sometimes. He gives us little pieces of his plan. He's not going to give you the whole playbook for your life, but sometimes he will reveal little pieces, little glimpses of the plan in order to give us some hope and give us some encouragement. And there was now this hope that God had revealed by and through Paul that he was going to protect all of them. And so now it was time to eat for their health, for their strength, with that calm assurance that no harm would come to them. So Paul took bread, he gave thanks to God, he broke it, he dispersed it, he began to eat. They also took of some meat, and they were, it says, good cheer. They were of good cheer. Hey, that's a God thing, because the storm's still happening. The boat's still in peril. Their lives are still in danger. But now, I guess, the faith of Paul and the faith of Paul's companions and their trust has rubbed off on everybody, and they're of good cheer. Verse 37 tells us there were 276 souls aboard. That's a lot of people. 216. That's 276 souls on the ship. What an amazing miracle that was about to take place. In verse 38, the eighth are filled. They cast even the wheat into the sea. Let's continue and pick up reading there in verse 37 and 38. It says in verse 37, "And we were all in the ship, 216 souls, and when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and cast out the wheat into the sea. And when it was day, they knew not the land, but they discovered a certain creek with a shore, into the which they were minded, if it were possible, to thrust in the ship. And when they had taken the anchors, they committed themselves into the sea, and loosed the rudder bands, and hoisted up the mainsail to the wind, and made towards shore. And falling into a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the forepart stuck fast and remained unmovable, but the hinder part was broken with the violence of the waves." Man, what a crazy thing they're all experiencing here. In verse 38, after they ate their fill, they cast even the wheat into the sea. They basically had accepted the inevitable. Whatever happens, happens kind of thing. They knew the ship could only handle so much in verses 39 through 40. When day broke, it says they didn't recognize where they were. They didn't recognize the land before them, but they saw a certain place, a certain shore, a creek and a shore, which they supposed looked like the best option that they had. They aimed the ship for that. They pulled the anchor. It says they cut the anchors. They knew they weren't going to need those again, so they just cut them loose. And and it says, it's kind of unclear in the way it's worded, but it looks like they cut the anchors loose. They loosed the rudder bands, hoisted up the mainsail, and they headed toward the shore. Verses 41, they ran aground. The front of the ship was stuck firmly, and it literally caused the ship to just tear apart. The whole back of the ship is being beat with the waves and moving around. The front of the ship can't move, and the ship's just being torn apart. And it's quite a violent thing. And so then if we look there in verse 42 through the end of the chapter, it says, "And the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. But the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, and commanded that they which could swim should cast themselves first into the sea and get to land, and the rest some on boards and some on broken pieces of the ship. And so it came to pass that they escaped all safe to land." What a wonderful thing. The soldiers, this was their advice. This was probably their mode of operation. This was probably what they would normally do in a certain situation. Their advice was that they should kill the prisoners lest they should escape. But the centurion, he was willing to save Paul. I would surmise that Paul had already made an impression on this centurion. I don't know what kind of conversations they had. I don't know. But I can just imagine if Paul was the preacher that he was, and everybody he talked to, whether it was a dignitary or whether it was a pauper on the side of the street somewhere, he preached one thing: Christ and Him crucified. And undoubtedly this long time that the centurion had been over, the guard of Paul had rubbed off on him. And so the centurion, it says, willing to save Paul, he kept these other soldiers from their purpose. He commanded that any could swim, they would jump in the sea and swim to shore. And if you couldn't swim, grab a board, grab a piece of the ship, grab something that would float and jump out and head to shore. And I think that's something else because, there's all the time, not all the time, but you see from time to time in the news about some ship that sinks. And it is literally unheard of. And especially in those days, it ain't like they had they basically had one lifeboat and they cut it loose already. They didn't have a bunch of life preservers. They just had chunks of the ship to hang on to. And the fact that all 276 souls made it to the shore safely is quite an astounding thing. That's only something God could do. And God had promised that all 276 of them would make it safely ashore, and they did. Now, safely ashore doesn't mean that they weren't a little waterlogged, and doesn't mean that they weren't a little, kind of torn up and maybe scraped up a little bit. It doesn't mean any of that. It just means they all made it safely to the shore. And I think that's a wonderful thing. In our lives, God is, there's all these storms that are coming, and we don't know they're there. And even when the morning comes and we see, hey, there's the end in sight, it might look unfamiliar. We might not know what to do. But we just have to trust God and trust His promise. He's going to see us through because He's got a place for us to go. And that's what He did with Paul and his companions. And we got just a few minutes. Let's just roll into Acts chapter 28 just a little bit here. We won't get very far into that, but we'll just at least kind of get a little bit of a start. Look at Acts chapter 28, verse 1. Because I haven't decided yet, I may do something different next Sunday night. We'll see. But I do want to get this. I do want us to finish Acts chapter, the book of Acts. Would be good to finish it this year if we could. But if you look there in verse 1 of Acts chapter 28, it says, "And when they were escaped, they knew that the island was called Melita." If you look online, you research a little bit. Some people say this was the island of Malta. But there again, there's a lot of things that are not real clear from history and these things, but it's called here the Isle of Melita. And it says in verse 2, "And the barbarous people showed us no little kindness." You got to really listen sometimes when you see King James English, because when it says no little kindness, that means that they showed them a lot of kindness. And you understand that. So it says, "And the barbarous people showed us no little kindness, for they kindled a fire and received us every one because of the present rain and because of the cold." So isn't it something to think about? We ought to be ashamed sometimes as Christians, because sometimes the barbarous people, the lost people, the people of this world, sometimes they're more commodious than we are. Sometimes they're more, hospitable than we are. Sometimes they're taking care of people and meeting their needs better than we do as Christians. And that ought not to be so, but you see it sometimes. That's what you see here. Hey, these people were pagans. They were barbarous people. They didn't know the first thing about God, but yet they saw these people, these 276 souls that had washed up on the shore, wet, waterlogged, likely cold from the Mediterranean Sea there. And it says they showed them abundant or great kindness. They kindled a fire for them. They received every one of them. And it was even raining. Just add insult to injury, but they got them a fire going, and they got them warmed up because it was cold out there, if you see in verses 1 and 2. And so in verse 3 there it says, "And when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, there came a viper out of the heat and fastened on his hand. And when the barbarians saw the venomous beast hang on his hand, they said among themselves, No doubt this man is a murderer, whom though he hath escaped the sea, yet vengeance suffereth not to live. And he shook off the beast into the fire and felt no harm. Howbeit they looked when he should have swollen or fallen down dead suddenly. But after they had looked a great while, they saw no harm come to him. They changed their minds and said that he was a god." And so, what an interesting scene here. It's a very memorable scene. Everybody knows this from Scripture. I always, sometimes when I haven't looked at the book of Acts in a fair bit of time, I always forget that this is sequestered at the very end. This is toward the end of his journey here. He's almost to Rome. And I think that, these pagan people, they're not unlike the people today, right? What's the thing everybody says today? Oh, it's karma, right? That's what people say. Oh, they got what was coming to them. That's exactly what these pagan people, these barbarous people on the Isle of Melita said. They said, oh, look, he must be a murderer, done some horrible thing because he might have escaped the sea, he might have escaped the shipwreck, but now look, a poisonous viper has jumped up and it is bit on his hand and likely he'll die within minutes, I'm sure they thought. And they began to see something different, though. Some time went by. He didn't fall down dead suddenly. He didn't even swell up, that would be conducive to a snake bite. It reminds me, one of the guys one of the men on my ordination council was Brother Toby Bain from Hope, Arkansas, and I've been friends with Brother Toby since 6th or 7th grade, somewhere along the lines there. And he's been down there pastoring in Hope for, I think, 11 or 12 years now. And this is a true story. There was like a little shed there on the church property at the time, and they were going to clean that shed out. I think there was an old box spring or something leaned up against the wall there, and he went to move that box spring, and actually a copperhead snake jumped up and bit him on the ankle. And he was bit by a poisonous snake, a copperhead snake. And so obviously they rushed him to the hospital. And they really, because they don't like to give people antivenom unless they absolutely have to, because I don't think you can have it maybe more than once or twice in your whole life, or I don't know. There's some reason they don't want to give it to you unless they absolutely have to. So all they could do was give him anti-inflammatories and maybe some antibiotics to keep them from being an infection, and just literally watch and wait to see what happened. And his ankle, I still remember it pretty vividly. He sent me pictures. His ankle swelled up to where it looked like it would just burst. It was so swollen. And it bruised, and it looked just terrible. It looked so terrible. But praise to God, it all healed up. He was okay. He didn't lose any limbs. But what an ordeal. And so what Brother Toby experienced is what normally happens when you get bit by a poisonous snake. What Paul experienced was a great miracle of God, and that he was safe, and he was not any harm done to him. I don't think it has to be said in this church congregation, but I'll say it anyway. It's a foolish thing for people when they take the Scriptures and they take it out of context, and they say, oh, well, look, we can tread on hot coals and not be burned, and we can handle poisonous snakes and not be bit, and all these kind of things. But, the Bible says not to tempt the Lord your God. The Bible says don't put God to the test. Don't tempt God, because really that's what people are doing. It's kind of like the old adage your parents told you, and you probably told your kids, if you play with fire, you're bound to get burned. And so these churches out there, I think there's a lot of them over in maybe North Carolina and east, somewhere over in there, where they do all this snake handling and stuff. And you know what? I've watched kind of I don't know, his little short 30-minute documentaries on TV some years ago about some of those churches. And the guy who was pastor was a relatively young guy, probably in his 30s. Well, he took over from his dad, and because guess what happened to his dad? His dad was the pastor previously. His dad was handling a poisonous snake. It bit him and it killed him. And so, I wouldn't advise going looking around for any snakes to wrangle. Remember, the head is the dangerous part, and don't pick them up by the tail. But that's a whole nother message. Moses, he picked up that serpent and it turned back into a rod. But let's get into this a few more minutes and we'll be done for tonight. And we'll have a little bit of a head start next time to finish up the book of Acts. And so he shook off the beast in verse 5. It fell into the fire. He felt no harm. They thought he should have died, and when he didn't, they said, well, he's not a murderer, but rather they turned 180 and said, well, he must be a god. And then in verse 7, in the same quarters were possessions of the chief man of the island, whose name was Publius, who received us and lodged us 3 days courteously. Again, think about this. This is kind of like the chief of the island. He's kind of like, you think of a Native American tribe or something. He's the chief. The place he lived, his quarters were nearby, and he received them. He lodged them courteously. He was hospitable to them. Verse 8, and it came to pass that the father of Publius lay sick of a fever and of a bloody flux, to whom Paul entered in and prayed and laid his hands on him and healed him. So when this was done, others also, which had diseases in the island, came and were healed, who also honored us with many honors. And when we departed, they loaded us, is the way we'd say it today, with such things as were necessary. They met their needs. They sent them off with supplies that they needed. And what an interesting thing. There's probably been a little bit of time that's went by. You don't see that Paul was doing, miracles like this on this sort on a daily basis. He might not have done a miracle like this for a couple years. But, he's been in Caesarea for so long. But yet when the timing is right and there's a need that Paul can meet through the power of God, he does that. He heals Publius. He heals his son. It's his father that was laying sick of the fever. He heals him of this fever, this bloody flux. And all he did is just prayed over him, laid hands on him, and healed him. And they were so amazed and so enamored by that, they brought him many sick people, and he laid hands on them and healed them. And they become really kind of almost like the people of honor on the island of Melita. I mean, they're now getting all the honor. But, I know that Paul and his companions likely were saying, no, give praise unto God, for he's the one who's done this. And I'd like to continue down a little bit further, but we have just a few minutes left. But let's look at verse 11. And after 3 months we departed in a ship of Alexandria, which had wintered in the isle, whose sign was Castor and Pollux. And landing at Syracuse, we tarried there 3 days. And from thence we fetched a compass and came to Rhegium. And after 1 day the south wind blew, and we came the next day to Puteoli. This is Puteoli, where we found brethren, and were desired to tarry with them 7 days, and so we went toward Rome. And from thence, when the brethren heard of us, they came to meet us as far as Apophorum and the 3 taverns, whom when Paul saw, he thanked God and took courage. And when we came to Rome, the centurion delivered the prisoners to the captain of the guard, but Paul was suffered to dwell by himself with a soldier that kept him. And it came to pass that after 3 days Paul called the chief of the Jews together, and when they were come together, he said unto them, Men and brethren, though I have committed nothing against the people or customs of our fathers, yet was I delivered prisoner from Jerusalem into the hand of the Romans, who, when they had examined me, would have let me go, because there was no cause of death in me. But when the Jews spake against it, I was constrained to appeal to Caesar, not that I had aught to accuse my nation of. For this cause, therefore, have I called for you, to see you and to speak with you, because that for the hope of Israel I am bound with this chain. And they said unto him, We neither receive letters out of Judea concerning thee, neither any of the brethren that came showed or spake any harm of thee. But we desire to hear of thee what thou thinkest. For as concerning this sect, we know that everywhere it is spoken against. And we'll just pick up this and finish it out next time. We easily get finished and be done with the book of Acts, Lord willing. So let's all stand to our feet. We'll be dismissed, give you a little taste of what we're going to talk about next week in Acts chapter 28. I hope you've had a good day in the Lord. Get some rest tonight. Pray for me. I have to work late tomorrow night. We have a bunch of maintenance, and it's really mission-critical stuff. Our main corporate firewall, some core switches, everything that affects our dispatchers, our 911 people, that are on the phones. It won't affect the phones, but it'll affect all the computer systems. It'll affect their normal handheld phones when they're not on 911 calls. And just pray that will go smoothly. It's a little bit of a burden on me because it's a big deal that goes well. So let's be dismissed in prayer and pray for one another. I'm going to ask Brother Ed if you would dismiss us, please.